Hey, Mr. Howard here to record a lecture on the Seafarer, a Anglo-Saxon poem similar in some ways to the Wanderer, but that's more clearly allegorical and a little bit more complex, which is why I put it second instead of first. We'll be able to see all of the things that we saw in the Wanderer in here, alliteration, alliterative verse, caesura, kenning, but we're also going to see elements that we talked about, allusions and allegories and symbols, and a really strong use of imagery, especially in the beginning of this. Just a couple of things before we start the Seafarer. I guess we could read this beginning bit that's in the excerpt. The Seafarer is an anonymous poem of uncertain date. It was found in the so-called Exeter Book, one of the 4 important collections of Anglo-Saxon poetry that have survived. The poem is lyrical and elegic, meaning a lyric. It was originally meant to be told as a song. That's what lyric poetry is. We know that songs have lyrics. Actually, fun fact, the lyric goes back to an instrument called the lyre, L-Y-R-E, which was invented by this guy named Orpheus or something like that in ancient Greece. But yeah, it's a lyric, it's a song, and it's an elegic poem. It's an elegy. The speaker of the poem is an old sailor. He speaks of the terror and the wonder he feels for the sea. The poem conjures up what going to sea in an open, high-prowed ship must have been like in Anglo-Saxon days. The Irish Sea and the North Sea waters were very different from the tranquil, warm waters of the Mediterranean Sea, which had been the waterway of the Greeks and Romans. Because of the importance of the sea to an island people, British poetry is frequently concerned with the sea, and the images and feelings expressed in the Seafarer recur in many later poems. So I think that's a good introduction to the piece itself. But let me give you a little bit more. The Seafarer is a really interesting poem because there's a huge debate. Like nerdy scholars like me, we debate the poem. The poem is almost like it's in 2 parts. It's all one poem, but around line 64, the tone, the feeling of the poem shifts. The focus of the poem shifts. The first half of the poem is about a storm at sea and what it's like being on the ocean. And the second half of the poem is about how to get to heaven and, God. And it's almost like very churchish. And so we end up with these 2 theories about the poem. One is that the poem really is 2 parts. That the first part is a well-known sort of popular poem that was told by the Anglo-Saxons before they became Christian. And that when it was written down by a Catholic priest, he added an ending to it that made the whole thing about God and heaven in a way that was never intended to be in the first place. And so really you've got 2 parts. You got the first oral tradition part, and then you've got a second part added by a Catholic priest. That's option A, and you can believe that if you want to. Option B is that the whole thing is one whole piece of literature. It was never 2 parts, and that the first part is a series of images that are supposed to help develop an allegory that the second part proves. And so we can talk about both those interpretations when we get to the end of it, but you'll want to look at it and think about it. I think there's a lot of ways to go through the poem, but I think the best thing for me to do is to look at it a little bit at a time and sort of break out and talk to you about what I see here. And then when I'm done with the whole thing, I'll read it to you from beginning to end, because you really, after you've examined it, you sort of need to hear the whole thing from beginning to end to feel the impact of it before I send you off to do some work or do an assignment on it. So, the Seafarer. One thing you're going to notice, I said you'll see all the same elements in here. You're going to see kennings, you're going to see alliteration, it's all over the place. But caesura, you remember that weird space in the middle of lines? You're like, wait a second, I don't see any caesuras in this. That's true. The translator of this poem is the same guy that we're going to read the translation of Beowulf from. His name is Burton Raphael, and he hated the weird spacing that people put in the middle of Anglo-Saxon poems as caesuras. It bothered him because it didn't feel natural. It felt, affected. And so what he does is he tries to put his punctuation in the middle of lines. You can see the comma there, comma here, period here, comma, period, comma, comma. He puts those in the middle of lines because what happens when you're reading and you reach a comma or a period is you pause. And so he's creating a caesura effect with the way that he punctuates the poem Normally, poems are punctuated at the ends of lines, so you'd see all the punctuation over here on the ends. But in this case, the punctuation's in the middle of lines to facilitate a caesura effect. So there's two ways that the author can display a caesura. One is by putting a big old space in the middle of the line, and the other is by putting the punctuation in the middle of the line. And Raphael does the punctuation. So, without further ado, I'm going to read the poem, break it down, and help you understand it. And we're going to focus on allusions and allegory and imagery, as well as the stuff that we dealt with the Wanderer. This tale is true and mine. It tells how the sea took me, swept me back and forth in sorrow and fear and pain, showed me suffering in 100 ships in 1,000 ports and in me. That's your first line. So your narrator is first person. And he says, this is a true story and it's my story. You get the sense that he's an exile because he's been at the ocean and he's been in 1,000 ports and 100 ships. He has no home. He's traveling around. Also the sea, you get the very civilization versus nature theme right off the bat. The sea is a negative entity. It took him and it swept him in fear and sorrow and pain, and it showed him suffering. That's personification of the ocean. It tells of the smashing surf. There's alliteration for you. When I sweated in the cold of an anxious watch, perched in the bow as it dashed under cliffs. I usually like to draw a picture of this on the whiteboard because it's really strong imagery. We have him sweating in the cold of an anxious watch. So it's winter in the north. It's cold, but he's sweating because he's anxious. He's in the front of a ship, the bow of a ship, as it dashes under cliffs. Have you ever had a cold sweat, like you're almost in a car accident or something, and you break out in that cold sweat? It's not because you're warm. You're sweating because you're terrified. And that's where this guy is. He's in a cold situation, but he's sweating. My feet were cast in icy bands bound with frost, with frozen chains, and hardship groaned around my heart. That's some pretty powerful imagery as well. It's so cold that the seawater that washes up on the deck of the ship freezes around his feet. He calls them icy bands, frozen chains. We also say that hardship groans around his heart. That's a very northern image. I'm from Vermont. Anybody who's ever been out on a frozen lake or the frozen ocean in the winter, sometimes the ice groans and creaks, and the idea is his heart is frozen in the sea of ice. Now, that's a hell image, too, if you're going to go with your allusions back to Norse mythology. His heart is frozen solid. He's in hell. This is a horrible situation. Hunger tore at my sea-weary soul. Also, he's hungry, but maybe not hungry in a literal sense, maybe also hungry in a figurative sense, hungry to be away from the ocean, hungry to be with people. Then he says, no man sheltered on the quiet fairness of earth can feel how wretched I was, drifting through winter on an ice-cold sea, whirled in sorrow, alone in a world blown clear of love, hung with icicles. So all of this ice, all of this winter imagery, but he's using interesting words like you who live in the quiet fairness of earth, sitting on your deck with a willow tree behind you. You don't know what it's like to be on a 30-foot boat in the middle of the North Sea in winter. It sucks. And you don't understand what it's like, and to be an exile and to be alone. He says he's wretched. He's whirled in sorrow, alone in a world blown clear of love. So the cold wind of the ocean has blown love straight out of his life. The hailstorms flew. The only sound was the roaring sea, the freezing waves. The roaring sea, this is a personification of the ocean. You can hear the sound of the sea, but in this case it's roaring like an animal, like something that's coming to get him. The song of the swan might serve for pleasure. The cry of the seafowl, the death noise of birds instead of laughter, the mewing of gulls instead of mead. And so here he's making some more comparisons. He's like, when you're out in the ocean like I am, you have the song of the swan for pleasure. You have the cry of seagulls instead of laughter. The death noises are kenning of birds instead of happiness. Instead of drinking alcohol and laughing with your friends, you just listen to seagulls all day. And so he's painting a bleak picture of life on a ship at sea during the Anglo-Saxon age. Storms beat on the rocky cliffs and were echoed by icy feathered terns and the eagle's screams. No kinsman could offer comfort there to a soul left drowning in desolation. Another great series of imagery. We can hear the storms beating on the rocky cliffs. His ship is being threatened to be smashed against the cliffs themselves. And there's these birds called terns. They're icy feathered. The thunder from the thunder snow, the storm, scares them out of their cliffs, and as they fly off, little icicles fly off their wings because it's that cold. And there's an eagle screaming overhead. Then he says, no kinsman could offer comfort there to a soul left drowning in desolation. This idea that the sea that he's drowning in isn't necessarily the sea. The sea is his aloneness. He's so surrounded by emptiness, by loneliness, that it's like an ocean drowning him. I mean, this is some pretty cool stuff from a guy who wrote 1,500 years ago. And now we are going to start a part of the poem that I say is a little bit ambivalent. He's going to try and make people who live on land understand what it's like at sea, and maybe why he goes back to the sea. Like, why would you go back to the sea if it's so miserable? So I'm going to read this section and interject a couple times. And who could believe, knowing but the passion of cities, swelled proud with wine and no taste of misfortune, how often, how wearily I put myself back on the paths of the sea. Night would blacken. It would snow from the north. Frost bound the earth and hail would fall the coldest seeds. That's a metaphor. And how my heart would begin to beat, knowing once more the salt waves tossing in the towering sea. The time for journeys would come, and my soul called me eagerly out, sent me out over the horizon, seeking foreigners' homes. So there's a couple of things here. He seems to hate the ocean, but also love the ocean. I think sailors maybe could relate to this. Anybody who's in the Navy. There's something powerful. There's something calling about the ocean, even though it's miserable, even though it's cold, even though he wishes he was on Earth, and even though people who are on dry land can't appreciate the horrors and the miserable nature of the ocean. At the same time, his heart beats, knowing once more the salt waves tossing in a towering sea. His soul calls him eagerly out over the horizon, seeking foreigners' homes. That's an interesting phrase too, foreigners' homes. Well, if he's an exile, every home he goes to see is a foreigner's home. If he's a Viking, he's looking for those foreigners' homes maybe to raid and pillage. If he's a missionary, then he's going to, speak the word of God. If this is an allegory in which the speaker is not necessarily an exile as somebody who's been exiled from their homeland and is a Viking, but an exile as somebody who's left, say, the Vatican and gone to England to preach the word of God, like maybe there's a double meaning here that makes the poem allegorical. Anyway, we'll keep reading. But there isn't a man on earth so proud, so born to greatness, so bold with his youth, grown so grave or so graced by God that he feels no fear as the sails unfurl, wondering what fate has willed and will do. There's a weird tension here. Look at this. In line 41, we've got the word God capitalized. And then in line 43, we've got the word fate capitalized. So essentially what the author's saying here is that there's nobody so proud that the sea doesn't scare them. There's nobody so graced by God that they're not worried about what fate has willed or will do. But this idea that God sort of coexists with those three creepy witches, the fates, is an ambivalence between which religion the author seems to believe in. No harps ring in his heart, no rewards, no passion for women, no worldly pleasures, nothing, only the oceans heave. So one of the reasons that the seafarer seems to like going to the sea in sort of a paradoxical way is that it gets rid of all of his other emotions. When you go out into the ocean, a storm hits, you can't think about anything else. No harps ring in his heart. You ever wake up with a song stuck in your head? Well, it turns out that if you're in the ocean in a storm and you're a sailor, that song is gone from your head. There's no earworm that breaks through the sea. No rewards. You ever work with somebody who always is thinking about payday and never shuts up about that? Well, it doesn't matter what your payday is. When the storm hits and you're off at sea, you're trying to stay alive. It's not about getting a payment. No passion for women. You ever know anybody who's always talking about, like sex or whatever? Like you can't think about your girlfriend. You can't think about those things when you're in the ocean and you're about to die from the storm. All you think about is that storm. No worldly pleasures, nothing, only the oceans heave. So I think this is an interesting idea that maybe one of the joys that the seafarer who's in exile gets from being on the ocean is that it's so intense that he can forget that he's in exile, that he can forget his hardships in just trying to stay alive. He continues. But longing wraps itself around him. Orchards blossom, the towns bloom, fields grow lovely as the world springs fresh. All these admonish that willing mind, leaping to journeys, always set in thoughts of traveling on a quickening tide. So summer sentinel, the cuckoo. Cuckoo to England is essentially what the robin is to us in America. It's a bird that shows the change of the seasons. The cuckoo sings in his murmuring voice, and our hearts mourn as he urges. Who could understand in ignorant ease what we others suffer as the paths of exile stretch endlessly on? So he keeps going back and forth here. He when he's at sea, he wishes he was on land. He thinks about the flowers blooming in springtime and wishes he was on land. But when he gets to land, all he can think about is going back to sea. And it makes him ambivalent. It makes him... Maybe it's not believable. I don't know. I mean, like, I guess on some level, the grass is always greener on the other side. No matter what choice he makes as an exile, he's unhappy. Where was I? And yet, and this is a great section if you're looking for alliteration, just listen to the alliteration here. And yet my heart wanders away, my soul roams with the sea, the whale's home, wandering to the widest corners of the world, returning ravenous with desire, flying solitary, screaming, exciting me to the open ocean, breaking oaths on the curve of a wave. That's line 64. I mean, this is building. He's breaking oaths on the curves of a wave. He must come back to shore and be like, I swear I'm never going out to sea again. And then he's like, I'm going back to sea, right? And so he's breaking oaths on the curve of a wave. I mean, this is powerful stuff. But line 64 is where the poem shifts. Let me read you this again, and we'll just read right into the shift and see if you can hear it. And yet my heart wanders away, my soul roams with the sea, the whale's home, wandering to the widest corners of the world, returning ravenous with desire, flying solitary, screaming, exciting me to the open ocean, breaking oaths on the curve of a wave. Thus the joys of God are fervent with life, where life itself fades quickly into the earth. The wealth of the world neither reaches heaven nor remains. No man has ever faced the dawn, certain which of fate's three threats would fall, illness or age or an enemy's sword, snatching the life from his soul. Wait, what? Do you feel the tone shift? It goes from like this guy on a boat to like, thus the joys of God are fervent with life. It feels like a prayer all of a sudden. We're talking about God. Where was God in that earlier bit? Not particularly strongly mentioned. So this tone shift is sort of jarring, but we're going to move from the tone shift and we're going to read the rest of this, and then we'll try and make up our own mind about what the poem's about. So he says, thus the joys of God are fervent with life, where life itself fades quickly into the earth. A translation of that might be that we appreciate living more when we're about to die. That if we're risking that's why people bungee jump and parachute and all those kinds of things, that somehow it quickens your appreciation of life if you're in a situation where you may die. Thus the joys of God are fervent with life, where life itself fades quickly into the earth. So this guy on this boat who's about to crash into a cliff apparently appreciates life more than somebody who may not be in such a situation. But the next line really throws me off. The wealth of the world neither reaches to heaven nor remains. This is a lesson. Hey, by the way, you can't take it with you. I've never seen a hearse with a luggage rack, like, what? Where is this coming from? Was there anything about wealth in that first half of the poem? No, the answer is no, there wasn't. No man has ever faced the dawn, certain which of fate's three threats would fall, illness or age or an enemy's sword, snatching the life from his soul. Translation, you never know if you're going to die when you wake up in the morning. Okay, yeah, an airplane could crash into your house and you could all die. I mean, like, that's possible, I guess. But, like, who wakes up in the morning and is freaking out about the possibility of death? Well, somebody who I guess is on the ship maybe, but it seems like it's coming out of left field. Also, by the way, fate's three threats, illness or age or an enemy's sword, those are the three fates in Norse mythology: sickness, age, and murder, right? And so that's a distinct allusion, a reference to the three fates. We've had allusions to God and heaven, and now we're alluding to the fates. Anyway, the next line is a really complicated and weird line. Just bear with me. The praise the living pour on the dead, flowers from reputation. Plant an earthly life of profit reaped even from hatred and rancor, of bravery flung in the devil's face. And death can only bring you earthly praise and a song to celebrate a place with the angels, life eternally blessed in the hosts of heaven. Woo! Whew, to translate that, essentially, you can't live your life for here on earth because you're going to die, right? And you got to live your life for a future in heaven. Even the reputation you leave behind you here on earth dies eventually. And so this idea that you have to live your life for the afterlife, not for the here and now, is essentially what he's saying there. If you want to read it and carefully analyze it, you can, but we'll just keep going. Now we have another shift. We go from talking about the ocean and the sea to this lesson about you can't take it with you, you got to live for your afterlife. And now we're going to talk about ancient Rome, because why not? The days are gone when the kingdoms of earth flourished in glory. Now there are no rulers, no emperors, no givers of gold as once there were, when wonderful things were worked among them, and they lived in lordly magnificence. Those powers have vanished, those pleasures are dead. The weakest survives, and the world continues kept spinning by toil. All glory is tarnished. The world's honor ages and shrinks, bent like the men who mold it. Their faces blanch as time advances. Their beards wither, and they mourn the memory of friends, the sons of princes sown in the dust. Wow. Okay, so Rome was here, and there are never going to be any emperors or greatnesses once their world. The world's getting worse and worse, and we're moving towards Armageddon, and everything's going to be terrible, and all of this, you can't take it with you, and the world doesn't last, and all of these lessons that we saw in The Wanderer earlier are sort of coming back in this poem, but again, they sort of feel out of place. The whole beginning of the poem is just about this guy and his love for the ocean. Of course, the sons of princes sown in the dust is probably a reference to a famous biblical verse that makes it an allusion. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. You may have heard that before. We come out of dust, and we go back into dust. The story that God picked up some dust and blew life into it, and it became human beings, and we turn back into dust when we're dead. Anyway, where was I? The soul stripped of its flesh knows nothing of sweetness or sour, feels no pain, bends neither its hand nor its brain. That's an Anglo-Saxon idea, this idea that we as human beings are sort of receptacles for a soul. Our body is like a sheath, and our soul is like a sword that is sheathed inside of it. And when we die, our soul is removed from this husk, this body that surrounds it. And then the soul, he says, stripped of its flesh, knows nothing of sweetness or sour, feels no pain. So these things like pleasure and pain and sweetness and sour and all of the physical things that we feel, these are not things of the soul. And if you dedicate your life to physical pleasure, just like if you dedicate your life to money, you're dedicating your life to something that's temporary, because your body's going to be husked off and thrown away when you're dead, and only your soul is going to remain, and none of the things that you lived your life for will exist anymore. Again, a very Christian message coming across towards the end of this poem. Let's see. A brother opens his palm and pours down gold on his kinsman's grave, strewing the coffin with treasures intended for heaven, but nothing golden shakes the wrath of God for a soul overflowing with sin, and nothing hidden on earth rises to heaven. Okay, well, we've got another lesson here. The guy's like, oh, by the way, you can't pay God off. Now, this is a dig directly at pagan cultures. If you look at old pagan cultures, they tend to bury people with a bunch of treasure and with a bunch of food. The Egyptians did this. The Greeks did this. The Anglo-Saxons, before they became Christian, did this too. You take a king and you bury him with a bunch of gold. Why? Because when he wakes up in the afterlife, he's going to have a bunch of gold. And so, in this image, we have a guy throwing money on the grave of his kinsman to try and buy off God. But you can't buy off God in a Christian sense, right? So this guy's like, stop doing that. Stop throwing your money into the ground, because nothing golden shakes the wrath of God. You can't pay off God to get somebody into heaven. Another Christian lesson coming through in this poem. But what does that have to do with a guy on a boat? I don't know. We all fear God. He turns the earth, set it swinging firmly in space, gave life to the world and light to the sky. Death leaps at the fools who forget their God. He who lives humbly has angels from heaven to carry him courage and strength and belief. A man must conquer pride, not kill it. Be firm with his fellows, chaste for himself, treat all the world as the world deserves, with love or with hate, but never with harm. Though an enemy seek to scorch him in hell or set the flames of a funeral pyre under his Lord, fate is stronger and God mightier than any man's mind. Okay, another series of lessons. Like everybody's afraid of God, I guess. He controls the world. Death leaps at the fools who forget their God, so apparently God's ready to kill you if you forget him. But then in positive lessons, he who lives humbly has angels from heaven to carry him courage and strength and belief. So be humble. Don't be arrogant. A man must conquer pride, not kill it. It's my favorite line in the poem, by the way. A man must conquer pride, not kill it. I think this is a very Anglo-Saxon thing. Normally we think of pride as a sin, but this guy says don't kill your pride. It's important to be proud about what you've accomplished. If you haven't done something you're proud of, what have you done with your life? I love that. I think that's true. We should be proud. We need to be proud of what we've done. We need to be happy with that, but you have to conquer your pride. You have to be in charge of your pride. If you let your pride be in charge of you, then it's nothing to be proud of. People can manipulate you through your arrogance. And so this idea that too much pride is bad, but having some pride is necessary to have led a meaningful life, I think that comes across pretty strongly. Then he says, be firm with his fellows, chaste for himself. Chaste is the root word of chastity, so he's suggesting not sleeping around and doing this for yourself. Then he says, treat all the world as the world deserves, with love or with hate, but never with harm. This is a very unchristian thing in this Christian section. I mean, the Bible says things like love your neighbor as yourself, and if somebody takes your shirt, offer them your coat and turn the other cheek. But this says treat the world as the world deserves, with love or with hate, but never with harm. So this guy is saying love the people who deserve to be loved, hate the people who deserve to be hated, but don't hurt those people. Let them get what's coming to them in time. Don't go off hurting people, but you go ahead and hate people who deserve to be hated. It's an interesting idea and not what comes across biblically. Then he says, though the enemy seek to scorch him in hell or set the flames of a funeral pyre under his Lord, fate is stronger and God mightier than any man's mind. So leave revenge in the hands of God. Leave revenge in the hands of fate. There's fate and God right together again. So finally he says, our thoughts should turn to where our home is. Consider the ways of coming there, then strive for sure permission for us to rise to that eternal joy, that life born in the love of God and hope of heaven. Praise the holy grace of him who honored us, eternal, unchanging creator of earth. Amen. It ends with amen, like a prayer, like a Sunday school lesson. And so that's the end of the poem. It says, instead of focusing on, I think in this case, where our home is heaven in an earthly exile sense, that we should spend our time trying to get there instead of spending our time accumulating wealth or enjoying pleasures or things of that nature. And so we have these two parts of the poem. And let's talk about that. Clearly we've seen some strong imagery at the beginning of this poem. We've seen allusions to to Norse mythology. We've seen allusions to Christianity and God. Those have been throughout this whole thing. But let's talk about allegory and symbolism. Again, probably about 70% of historians and scholars look at this poem and say, it's two poems. There's this first part that's all about a guy at sea, and then there's this second part that's all about going to heaven, and the two parts don't communicate very well. And so the poem on some level is maybe a little bit of a failure to have unity. But there's 30% who say this is all one poem written by one author to one purpose. I'm kind of in between those two. But the people who say this is all one poem, the line they focus on is down towards the bottom here. They look at line 117 right here, and they say, hey, this is the key to the whole thing, and this sets up the poem as an allegory. Our thoughts should turn to where our home is. Home in this case is heaven. That's a symbol, where you go up with God in heaven. Well, in the case of the author, he's in exile. The paths of exile stretch endlessly on. And so the home for the exile in this case, is heaven. So if the seafarer isn't a specific seafarer, like a surface level, he's a seafarer. He's a guy on a boat trying to make it to land, trying to find a home and a family. But if he's a symbol, if the seafarer is the soul, and the boat is our body, remember the soul stripped of its flesh, then this whole thing becomes a metaphor for life. We're all seafarers. We're all lost on the sea. And it's nice that it's a seafarer image, because as a seafarer, we're on a boat. The boat is our body. The boat's going to sink. The boat's going to rot. It's not going to last forever. But we are in charge of where the boat goes. We steer it. We direct it. This idea that in our lives, we should be directing our boats, he says, to home, to heaven. So the whole thing becomes this metaphor, where the first part is an illustration of the hardship of life on Earth, the cold cliffs, the freezing climate, the solitude, the misery, and yet there's a home you can get to with kinship and friendship and food and happiness, and that home is sort of unattainable while this seafarer is alive. But if the idea is that when he dies, he's close enough to shore to wash up on there because he's been sailing in the right direction his entire life, then the whole thing sort of clicks together and makes sense. And the second half about how to get to heaven is really about how to steer your metaphorical ship and how to live your life as an exiled soul on earth, to be reunited with God after your death. And so it works on that level. Our thoughts should turn to where our home is and consider the way of coming there. Then strive for permission to rise to that eternal joy. Can you see how it works? So some critics think that the whole poem was designed that way. I'm sort of, like I said, I'm halfway in between. I think probably it was a well-known Anglo-Saxon song about the seafarer, but that when the guy wrote it down, he added a Christian ending to it to make the first part allegorical, to make the journey of the exile on the sea a metaphor for everybody's life, and to try and convert people to Christianity, because that's the goal of a lot of Anglo-Saxon poems. So, you can read this whole thing again, but this idea that we're all seafarers and we're piloting our own ships, our body, through the sea of life, and that the ocean itself is maybe time or the world, I think this ambivalent part makes sense too. There isn't a man so proud, so born to greatness, so bold with his youth, grown so grave or graced by God that he feels no fear as the sails unfurl. He wants to be on land. He wants to be quote unquote home, but he doesn't want to leave the sea. He's drawn to the sea, and I think that's true for most of us. Like, life is enticing. We want to live life no matter how hard it is, no matter how difficult the hardships. There's something about it that draws us to it, even if we know theoretically there's a better place we go to. If somebody came up to us with a gun and was like, hey, do you want to go to heaven right now? I'll shoot you and you can go. Most of us are like, no. Even if you believe that it's a better place, you don't necessarily want to end your life and go there, immediately. So I think that's maybe something of what comes across here. And so you can actually stop and you can analyze the poem in a more deep way. And I'm not going to force you to do that. But with that thought in mind, I'm just going to read you the poem. No commentary, no nothing. I'll read it to you from beginning to end. Just, close your eyes and listen and think about how the first part might be an allegory for the last part and how the two parts fit together. And then try and decide, is it two authors? Is it one author? Is it does it work for you as a piece of literature, or does it really feel like it needs to be split in half? Because I'm going to have you write a reaction about it after this. So here we go. The Seafarer, translated by Burton Raphael. This tale is true and mine. It tells how the sea took me, swept me back and forth in sorrow and fear and pain, showed me suffering in 100 ships in 1,000 ports and in me. It tells of smashing surf, where I sweated in the cold of an anxious watch, perched in the bow as it dashed under cliffs. My feet were cast in icy bands, bound with frost, with frozen chains, and hardship groaned around my heart. Hunger tore at my sea-weary soul. No man sheltered on the quiet fairness of earth can feel how wretched I was, drifting through winter on an ice-cold sea, whirled in sorrow, alone in a world blown clear of love, hung with icicles. The hailstorms flew. The only sound was the roaring sea, the freezing waves. The song of the swan might serve for pleasure, the cry of seafowl, the death noise of birds instead of laughter, the mewing of gulls instead of mead. Storms beat on the rocky cliffs and were echoed by icy feathered terns and the eagle's screams. No kinsman could offer comfort there to a soul left drowning in desolation. And who could believe, knowing but the passion of cities, swelled proud with wine and no taste of misfortune, how often, how wearily I put myself back on the paths of the sea. Night would blacken, it would snow from the north, frost bound the earth, and hail would fall, the coldest seeds, and how my heart would begin to beat, knowing once more the salt waves tossing in the towering sea. The time for journeys would come, and my soul called me eagerly out, set me over the horizon, seeking foreigners' homes. But there isn't a man on earth so proud, so born to greatness, so bold with his youth, grown so grave or so graced by God that he feels no fear as the sails unfurl, wondering what fate has willed and will do. No harps ring in his heart, no rewards, no passion for women, no worldly pleasures, nothing. Only the oceans heave. But longing wraps itself around him. Orchards blossom, the towns bloom, fields grow lovely as the world springs fresh, and all of these admonish that willing mind, leaping to journeys, always set in thoughts of traveling on a quickening tide. So summer sentinel, the cuckoo, sings in the murmuring voice, and our hearts mourn as he urges. Who could understand in ignorant ease what we others suffer, as the paths of exile stretch endlessly on? And yet my heart wanders away. My soul roams with the sea, the whale's home, wandering to the widest corners of the world, returning ravenous with desire, flying, solitary, screaming, exciting me to the open ocean, breaking oaths on the curve of a wave. Thus the joys of God are fervent with life, where life itself fades quickly into the earth. The wealth of the world neither reaches to heaven nor remains. No man has ever faced the dawn, certain which of fate's three threats would fall, illness or age or an enemy's sword snatching the life from his soul. The praise the living pour on the dead flowers from reputation. Plant a life of earthly profit, reaped even from hatred and rancor, of bravery flung in the devil's face, and death can only bring you earthly praise and a song to celebrate a place with the angels, life eternally blessed in the hosts of heaven. The days are gone when the kingdoms of earth flourished in glory. Now there are no rulers, no emperors, no givers of gold, as once there were when wonderful things were worked among them, and they lived in lordly magnificence. Those powers have vanished. Those pleasures are dead. The weakest survives, and the world continues kept spinning by toil. All glory is tarnished. The world's honor ages and shrinks, bent like the men who mold it. Their faces blanch as time advances. Their beards wither, and they mourn the memories of friends. The sons of princes sown in the dust. The soul, stripped of its flesh, knows nothing of sweetness or sour, feels no pain, bends neither its hand nor its brain. A brother opens his palms and pours down gold on his kinsman's grave, strewing his coffin with treasures intended for heaven, but nothing golden shakes the wrath of God for a soul overflowing with sin, and nothing hidden on earth rises to heaven. We all fear God. He turns the earth. He set it swinging firmly in space, gave life to the world and light to the sky. Death leaps at the fools who forget their God. He who lives humbly has angels from heaven to carry him courage and strength and belief. A man must conquer pride, not kill it. Be firm with his fellows, chaste for himself. Treat all the world as the world deserves, with love or with hate, but never with harm. Though an enemy seek to scorch him in hell or set the flames of a funeral pyre under his Lord, fate is stronger and God mightier than any man's mind. Our thoughts should turn to where our home is. Consider the ways of coming there. Then strive for sure permission for us to rise to that eternal joy, that life born in the love of God and the hope of heaven. Praise the holy grace of him who honored us, eternal, unchanging creator of earth. Amen.